Hi, I appreciate you listening to this podcast. This is Gary Zacharias, and this is the Apologist bookshelf. There's a book called Christianity on Trial, and I've done a couple of previous podcasts on that, talking about Christianity and science, and is Christianity guilty of slaughtering and butchering a bunch of people? And so this, by the way, the subtitle of the book is Arguments Against Anti-Religious Bigotry by Carroll and Shiflett are the two authors. So I won't spend much time talking about the book. I think it's excellent. Chuck Colson gives it a thumbs up, Doug Grotice, and some others. So I know you get something out of the book because it's dealing with the things that we hear that are anti-Christian, things like, oh, they've ruined the environment, they've endorsed slavery, and on and on. And we'll come across another chapter soon that talks about the slavery issue. But I want to do the one that's actually the opener, the first chapter, and it's called Christianity and the Foundation of the West. So here's the story that we're being told these days. Hey, Christianity is on the wrong side of history. They've dug in their heels. Christians don't like progress. The charge is that in politics, the Christian has always come in on the side of despots and oppressors. And they have inquisitors and book burners. They're not interested in probing minds and pamphleteers and trying to, get the human mind opened up. And they're against equality, and they're patriarchal. They're absolutism as opposed to individualism. They're small-minded. And so the two authors say the most popular version of this indictment sees everything in Western history after the fall of Rome as a huge struggle to get the human spirit out from under the shadow, the domination of the Christian church, which has ruined everything. And thank goodness now, because of the Enlightenment and other things, the Renaissance, that we've broken free and thrown the shackles of Christianity aside. Well, that usually spares, by the way, the authors point out that this attack on Christianity usually spares the message of Jesus, right? Everybody likes Jesus. But it's turning on the early church leaders, like Paul and the church fathers and the clerics of the Middle Ages. So they go after them instead and say they're the problem. It's every sin of Christianity got its start in the medieval West. And they point out you can even see that in high school textbooks. And there's a quote here, but I'll skip over that. But he said, these authors said there's a really big difference there. That if you look, the Middle Ages were actually what they call the incubator for a lot of our most cherished modern values and institutions. And he says the origins of these values and these institutions came about in a very early stage of the church development. So how about this? Here's Clement of Alexandria, 200 or so A.D. He says both slave and free must equally philosophize, whether male or female, whether barbarian, Greek, slave, whether an old man or a boy or a woman. And we must admit that the same nature exists in every race and the same virtue. Wow, that is amazing. Remember, this came about. Clement of Alexandria, 200 A.D., is speaking at the time of the height of the Roman Empire, and people in the Roman Empire would not have agreed with that. That was so unusual. And the authors point out that would have been unusual for the empires that stretched across Asia, the ones that were in the Americas, the ones that were in Africa, south of the Sahara. Isn't that something? So why would he say that? Why would Clement come up with that? Well, if human beings are God's own handiwork, the authors say, in other words, they're made in God's image, then they must be all moral equals. And if they're moral equals, then the progress that we associate with Western civilization can't be very far behind. Now, if you don't have belief in moral equality, how do you get the rise of Western legal tradition? They said we're all supposed to be equal before the law. Why? Because we're made in the image of God. How would we recognize individual rights if we didn't say human beings are God's own handiwork? It says without moral equality, democracy. So that would not have come about. I thought that was interesting. They said, let's take that famous expression from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then the Founding Fathers created a nation that was committed to that principle. Now, it took a long time, didn't it? It had to be made self-evident that all men were created equal, and that took a long time. They said somebody could write such a statement in 1776 and expect the readers not to laugh at that because there was this common culture. That was the legacy of Western Christendom that said we were endowed with our rights because of our Creator. Now I said, all right, it says Christians weren't the first or the only people to insist on the equality of mankind and the value of each human. No, that's not exactly right. They said there were Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius. They held that all individuals were equal, but they said there was something pretty grim and cheerless about the Stoics. They never tapped the popular longing for a sense of moral equality the way Christians did. Now, I said the Jews of the ancient world did put a great value on human life, but in the end, Judaism was so tribal. It was so interested in who your parents were and what your connections were. You had those 12 tribes. So those were huge obstacles for people to, pagans especially, to overcome. Things like circumcision and the foods and things like that and sacrifices. It was Christianity that proved the more powerful lure. So next subsection of this chapter is called How Christian Ethics Transformed the Pagan World. So they said, think about the early churches. They had humbler, free classes of people there. Women were conspicuous. There was a notable presence in some churches of women of high status. I mean, think about what Paul said. There's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There's neither male nor female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. They said that resonates 2,000 years later. Can you imagine, they said, what that would have been like? You're in this Roman Empire, and your social class, everybody from the emperor on down to the slave, it was confining. And you could buy and sell people like oxen. So how much more inspiring was that early Christian message to women? Women enjoyed a higher status. They had more autonomy among Christians than among pagans. They could expect better treatment from their husbands. According to one sociologist, pagan Roman women were 3 times as likely as Christians to have been married before age 13. Wow. Christian women got more options as far as who they wanted to wed. They were less likely to be forced into an abortion. Church expected Christian men to remain faithful to their wives. Whoa, that was not a Roman practice. If widowed, a Christian woman had more freedom to choose whether to remarry or not, knowing that if that there was a congregation that would look after them if they were going to stay alone. And another person said it's an established fact that everywhere progress and free choice of a spouse accompanied progress in the spread of Christianity. So as Christianity spread, so did the idea of women being able to have a free choice of who they wanted to marry. So women's status in the church itself was favorable for the times. Think about Paul again. People say, oh, Paul, he was so against women. No, he had repeated emphasis on the obligations of husbands to wives. In fact, Thomas Cahill, who's a really interesting historian, I hope you have a chance to read some of his works, he wrote that in Paul, we find the only affirmation of sexual equality in the whole of the Bible. And they said that's the first one ever to be made in any of the many literatures of our planet. Can I say that again? So Paul, he says it's the first real call of sexual equality anywhere in the world. A.N. Wilson said the same thing. Says you'd be hard put to find anyone who believed in sexual equality in the modern sense, and the person who comes closest is Paul. Paul also said if you're going to convert, you come from a Gentile background, you'll have the same status as your brethren who had a Jewish origin. Well, that took Christianity and moved it to a much broader view, didn't it? It said the ancients took for granted that your religion was linked to maybe one city or one people, but Christianity shattered that small, narrow-minded outlook for all time. Christianity morality, they said, was a shock absorber on everyday life. It was a pretty tough life back then, and it gentled things. They used the word gentling, the private realm. For example, let's take the gladiatorial games. They were awful. Scores of men would slaughter one another, and they'd slaughter animals, and they'd cheer like crazy. There was bloodlust, and they would hoot and jeer at the people who lost. Said some of these shows could have thousands of pairs of combatants, not to mention all sorts of beasts that got battled to the death. But Christians deplored this. They were repulsed by the way it debased human life. Isn't that great? It's good to hear. It says even Edward Gibbon. Now, he is not a Christian, but Gibbon, the great 18th century historian, he had to concede the impressive ethical standards of these early Christians. He talked about their pure and austere morals. It says they rejected infanticide. They didn't go for the abandonment of unwanted babies like the Romans did. They opposed the exploitation of children for erotic pleasure. They elevated the status of women. They accepted and even broadened the Jewish tradition, taking care of the poor. They exalted humility. They preached the gifts of charity and love. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And, like the infants got killed, especially the girls. They'd get rid of girls. They didn't want girls. They were inconvenient. Boys got disposed of when they were deformed. So it says most families just refused to raise a second girl. But Christians, on the other hand, they had a very different attitude. Female infants were going to be cherished equally with males. Why? They were gifts of God. We're back to that again. In the 360 to 363 AD time period, you have the Emperor Julian, called the Apostate. He tried to get rid of Christianity, and he admitted, quote, "It is generosity toward non-members, care for the graves of the dead, and pretended holiness of life that have specially fostered the growth of atheism." That's funny. That was Christianity. It was called atheism back there. So even he admitted the wonderful things that Christians were doing. Think about the plagues that they had back in that time period. Who were the ones that took care of the suffering? It was Christians. The pagans, they said they were abandoning their sick the first time they saw any form of a disease. And it says Christians were trying to save the old and the weak. There was Christian charity that exercised a powerful pull on converts. Christians were the ones that were dedicated to the poor, the ill, the disabled, the imprisoned, the elderly, the widowed, and the exploited. In larger cities, what did the church do? They founded orphanages. They founded what would later be called hospitals. And as the Roman Empire began to spiral into chaos, in the 400s and all, it was the church that expanded its philanthropy until it was the only place the poor could get some help. So the concepts of mercy and humility, they were terrible in the pagan culture. In fact, they were ridiculed by people of highest learning. But the Christians came along and flipped that upside down. How about the church-state rivalry? Let's talk about that for just a minute in this chapter. So you had a Theodosius the Great. He allowed the Visigoths in the late 300s to come into Rome, and he didn't really want them finally, and there was a mob, and he sicked the Roman troops on them, and there's a lot of slaughter. And a bishop, Ambrose of Milan, talked to Theodosius and lectured him about this butchery. And now he threw down the gauntlet. He said, "You must repent, or you won't have the Holy Eucharist." And he called it a condemnation. It was great valor. And the principle that came out of that was no ruler was above God's law. The church's moral authority flowed from God, not the state. And it said, at the end, Theodosius considered he did public penance at the cathedral in Milan. So Ambrose provided an example that echoed through the centuries. So the idea was to check these secular authorities, keep them from setting up suffocating, unimpeded power that rulers at other places usually enjoyed. So that was really important for the idea of freedom and for carving out separate spheres of influence. You have the church and you have the state, two separate spheres. Then you got Augustine, late 300s to early 400s AD, the great North African bishop. It says after Paul, he was the most important Christian philosopher. So he wrote this book called The City of God. And he had this view. Empires rise and fall. It's just the way things are. It's just part of nature. But the church's mission stands apart from any secular institution. The true church endures. So it's the government's duty to take instruction from religion, not the other way around. So that provided a basis for ideals of human freedom and individual rights. Augustine said, no, the state can be a ravenous predator. It's got to be restrained. But he wasn't propounding an anti-government theory, the authors say. His view is that we are all fallen. People are fallen, and the state is necessary. It's got to maintain order. But he clearly limited the role of secular powers, and he helped set Christendom, Western Christendom, on a course in which the believer's duty to God might trump the obligations to the state. That's a big, important deal, isn't it? So it's the tradition of having a dissenting conscience without, we got to give Augustine his credit there. So when discussion of individual liberty finally comes into the view of the West, it's a gift of Christendom. So thanks in part to Augustine, neither church nor state in the West would ever have a real easy time absorbing the other. So earthly rulers were not free to do anything they wanted, and even the church couldn't do anything it wanted. So it was very different in Europe than other civilizations nearby. How about this next section is how Christianity preserved civilization and then extended it. So they said, time after time, Christian clerics would go into barbarian lands and change the hearts of those people and brought them into the Christian church. They said the fate of classical culture in the West soon rested entirely in the church's hands. It was there for hundreds of years. It says in the 9th and 10th centuries, as an example, Western Christendom was just getting pounded. You had Vikings slamming it from the north and the west, and Muslims from the south, Magyars from the east. It says really difficult. And they said you had monks during this time period, and especially Irish monks saved civilization. That's back to Thomas Cahill again, how the Irish saved civilization. It's true. They salvaged Latin literature from oblivion. They scattered across Europe monasteries that restored learning and books to their rightful place. They reinvigorated literature. They offered to pagan peasants an example of the power of the Christian message. Yeah, I think that's really good to hear things like that. He says, think about monasteries. What else did they do? They had mechanical and technical inventions, clocks to brewing, mining, water power. Books were just one of a lot of legacies of the monastic movement. Now, let me break in at this point. I do a talk on this topic, and I want to bring up what often we hear, that the Middle Ages were called sometimes the Dark Ages. Right? You heard that one? They were the Dark Ages. And why? Because Christianity ruled everything and put a blanket over everybody and didn't allow any freedom. It's the opposite. It was not a unscientific, technologically backward time. They were making all sorts of amazing inventions and moving things along scientifically during this time period. Okay, they got another section called How Christianity Set the Stage for the Rule of Law. So maybe we should talk about that for a second before the chapter is over. So it says the Middle Ages have become an embarrassment to many Christians because we get people that say, we got the heretics, they got persecuted, we got Jews that were persecuted, we got the bloodletting of the Crusades, and it's horrifying things. But they cover that in other chapters. But it says these are historically naive Christians. They don't appreciate medieval Christendom. Yeah, they had moral lapses, definitely. But what about their achievements? The Middle Ages, for example, that was the area that they first came up with representative and constitutional government, based on the idea that power has got to have limits. They enforced property rights. They had taxation by consent. It says the Bible's skeptical view of secular power. Look at 1 Samuel 8. Take a look at that sometime. I teach the Bible as literature, and I have my students read that. Samuel says, oh, you want a king? Well, let me tell you what a king will do. It's pretty powerful. You might enjoy reading that. But they said that helped check the ambitions of would-be tyrants. And so the church stood up to secular bullies. It had humanitarian and civilizing missions that they had to accomplish. So the church actually reined in the warrior spirit, and it created the code of chivalry. The church put checks on greater powers. Medieval kings didn't have the absolute powers that later monarchs would seize. The church carried on the Roman tradition of law into barbarian backwaters. And it said medieval monarchs either lacked a divine or a legal right to do whatever they pleased. And then the last part of the chapter here talks about roots of capitalism and popular consent. But now, what do you need if you're going to have a market economy? You got to have secure ownership of property, right? You got to own the property. And that property is secure only when the law treats everyone alike. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, we're all made in the image of God. We are all alike. And there's something about the Christian teaching, one person said, that was essential to the emergence of the market order, especially the underlying equality of human nature. So if everybody's equal in the eyes of God, then it began to be recognized that all should be equal before the law. And that's the modern market system getting started. The market economy thrives when you have invention and creativity. That was also a gift of the Christian West that started out in this medieval period. The Judeo-Christian belief in the dignity of manual labor was really important too. And finally, he said you get the emergence of a market order when you have a belief in progress and a sense of linear time, not just that there's a wheel that spins around, but you're getting someplace. The idea of progress, that's an expression of optimism, a human possibility. Now, we in the West really believe that, don't we? So it's no wonder that the first true Renaissance in Western Europe didn't occur in the 16th century, right? The Renaissance with a capital R. But they said the first true Renaissance occurred in the 12th century, once civilization got kind of consolidated under Christianity. And then the philosophers got their efforts to retrieve the treasures of ancient learning. And it says early Christianity had embraced election of bishops and participatory decision-making on a wide scale. So this is all happening. So it said at the end, it says it wasn't a dead and stagnant time. The Middle Ages was fertile. It was creative. It was even liberating. So they said the Middle Ages produced some amazing people, and it's a time period that we shouldn't be ashamed of as Christians. So we've heard a lot of false stories about the Middle Ages, and I hope you feel that this book is trying to set things like that straight. So the book is called Christianity on Trial, and I think you'd like it a lot. It covers a lot of issues that we think are true, and we find out, oh, they're not. And actually Christianity comes off much better than modern critics would suggest. Well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast. I hope you're having a good day, and talk to you later.